Okay, so let's continue by reviewing the development of the urinary system. First, take a look to the objectives of this lecture. You'll see that the lecture will follow this same layout. The renal system starts developing during week 4 of intrauterine life. At this point, the embryo is made up of 3 primitive germ layers, the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. The mesoderm also has 3 parts: the paraxial mesoderm, which flanks the embryo's future vertebral column, the intermediate mesoderm, which is just lateral to the paraxial mesoderm, and the lateral plate, which is the most lateral of all. The intermediate mesoderm on either side of the embryo condenses to form a cylindrical structure called the urogenital ridge. This ridge runs parallel to the embryo's future vertebral column, and it gives rise to both the urinary and the genital systems. The portion of the urogenital ridge called the nephrogenic cord develops into the urinary structures. Now, during the development of the urinary system, there are 3 sets of structures that emerge from the nephrogenic cord, and they form in a craniocaudal fashion, that is from head to tail end, as many of the structures of the embryo. So let's see these 3 structures, then we will concentrate in the last one, which is the one that gives rise to the adult kidney. The first structure to emerge from the nephrogenic cord is the pronephros, which appears in the neck region of the embryo at the beginning of week 4. The pronephros consists of the pronephric duct and the nephrotomes in front of it. The pronephric duct is basically a pipe that runs down the length of the nephrogenic cord, and the nephrotomes are small chunks of tissue that break off from the nephrogenic cord. However, the pronephros doesn't produce urine and regresses by the end of week 4. That means that it disappears completely. But before the pronephros completely disappears, a second set of structures called the mesonephros appears in the thoracic and upper lumbar region of the nephrogenic cord. The mesonephros has a mesonephric duct and a mesonephric tubules in front of it. The mesonephric duct develops off of the pronephric duct, making it longer so that it reaches all the way to the cloaca, which is the last part of the primitive digestive tract. So for a short while, the urinary and the digestive system share a common exit. Just like the nephrotomes, the mesonephric tubules break off as chunks of tissue from the nephrogenic cord. The mesonephric tubules are hollow and S-shaped tubes. On one end, they connect to the mesonephric duct, and at the other end, the tubule forms a cup-shaped called Bowman's capsule that you are already familiar with, around a clump of capillaries which are called the glomerulus. This is the filtration system of the mesonephros. This primitive structure extracts fluid from the capillaries, and the fluid flows down the duct to form urine, which drains through the mesonephric duct into the cloaca. This system is in place until week 10, when the permanent kidneys take over and the mesonephros regresses just like the pronephros. But around week 5, the metanephros develops and it forms the permanent kidneys. So for a couple of weeks, the metanephros and the mesonephros coexist. The metanephros forms in the pelvic region. First, intermediate mesoderm near the mesonephric duct differentiates into metanephric mesoderm, sometimes called the metanephric blastema. The metanephric mesoderm produces growth factors that travel to the mesonephric duct. In response, the duct sprouts a small bud called the ureteric bud, which is connected to the mesonephric duct through the ureteric stalk. And that's it for the introduction of these three parts. Now we have to concentrate to focus better in more detail on how the metanephros gives rise to the kidneys. So, over time, the ureteric bud lengthens and it secretes growth factors that cause the metanephric mesoderm to grow. This is called reciprocal induction because the metanephric mesoderm and the ureteric bud promote each other's growth. Eventually, the ureteric bud reaches the metanephric mesoderm and grows into it. The metanephric mesoderm surrounds the end of the ureteric bud, leaving just the ureteric stalk uncovered. The ureteric stalk lengthens and forms the ureter around week 6. The ureteric bud within the metanephric mesoderm divides in half to form the renal pelvis during week 7 and 8. Then each half divides again later to form two major calyces. These divisions continue until the major calyces, the minor calyces, and finally the millions of collecting tubules have all taken shape. The cells in the collecting tubules deliver a signal to the surrounding metanephric mesoderm that the collecting system is in place, triggering the formation of the nephrons. The nephrons are basic functional units of the kidneys, and they start forming during week number 8. Each newly formed collecting tubule is surrounded by a cap of metanephric mesoderm. Cells in the collecting tubules, which come from the ureteric bud, signal the nearby metanephric mesoderm to form round cell clusters called metanephric vesicles. The vesicles elongate and bend into S-shaped tubes, which are similar to the ones in the mesonephric, the mesonephric tubules. One end of the tube connects with the collecting tubules, and that part becomes the distal convoluted tubule. The other end of the tube forms the proximal convoluted tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule forms a little cap called Bowman's capsule, which will hold clumps of capillaries that arise from branches off of the aorta to form the glomerulus. The portion in between the distal and proximal convoluted tubules lengthens and gives rise to the loop of Henle. Around week 10, these nephrons start producing urine, and at that point the metanephros takes over as the permanent kidney. As the permanent kidney develops, they move up from the pelvis to assume their adult position. So they start at the level of S1, S2, and they reach their final position between the levels of T12 and L3. Also during this ascent, the kidneys rotate 90 degrees, so the ileum of the kidneys enter by facing the aorta. Initially, the kidneys are nourished by internal iliac arteries that branch off from the aorta, but as the kidneys ascend, the aorta forms branches at higher and higher levels to supply them with blood. When the kidneys reach the final home in the upper abdomen, the renal arteries form at the level of L2 and the lower branches degenerate. If any of them remains, they are called supernumerary arteries, which are end arteries. So if they are damaged, basically obstructed, then that will result in the necrosis of the part of the kidney they are supplying. If we rewind a bit, while the kidneys are forming, the bladder and the urethra are developing as well. So the process begins in week 4, when a wall of tissue called urorectal septum forms in the cloaca. You already reviewed that in the division of the anal canal and the urogenital sinus. So the urorectal septum splits the cloaca into posterior anal canal for the digestive tract and an anterior urogenital sinus for the genital and urinary structures. The top portion of the urogenital sinus stretches out to form the primitive bladder. Now, remember the ureters developed from the ureteric stalk, and they open into the mesonephric ducts, which drain urine into the bladder. During weeks 5 and 6, the mesonephric ducts are slowly absorbed into the bladder to form the smooth part of the bladder wall, which is called the vesical trigone. The vesical trigone is a triangular region that contains the openings of the ureters as well as the opening of the urethra. The middle portion of the urogenital sinus forms the urethra in the female and the prostatic and membranous parts of the urethra in males. Finally, the bottom portion of the urogenital sinus grows towards the genital tubercle, forming either the clitoris or the penis. Okay, as a quick recap, the nephrogenic cord gives in part of the is a part of the urogenital ridge, gives rise to the 3 sets of foundational renal structures: the pronephros, the mesonephros, and the metanephros. The metanephros are the permanent kidneys, and they form from the metanephric mesoderm, which forms the nephrons, as well as from the ureteric bud, which forms the collective system. The metanephric mesoderm forms a small part of the bladder, but the urogenital sinus is responsible for most of the bladder and the entire urethra, starting with the 4th week. The permanent urinary system is mature enough to secrete urine starting around week 10 of intrauterine life. And now I think is one of those quick videos showing all these processes in a row. Let's see it.
That's all, folks.